If you were to ask me, what is Night in the Woods about? Well, first off, I'd have to tell you that's a pretty complicated question, but if I were to try and answer it as accurately as possible, I'd say it's about a lot of things. It's partially about uncertainty, about being a young person unsure about who you are, who you want to be, and finding that aspirational person's place in society. But it's also about struggle, about what it looks like to do a good day's work, and what the fruit of those labors should look like, and more importantly, who should ultimately profit off that work. And it's also a game about just hanging out with your friends and not doing much of anything. About sharing each other's company for no better reason than you enjoy being around them. To put it as simply as I can, Night in the Woods is a game about people. Or, I guess, animal people, technically, but people all the same. Now, if I in return asked you what kind of game Night in the Woods is, what would you say? I imagine if we took a formal poll of the audience, the most popular answer would probably be an adventure game. And generally speaking, that's not a bad choice. Because for the most part, when it comes to assigning a genre to a video game, the question you're essentially asking is, what do you do in said game? And in the case of Night in the Woods, the majority of what you do is just talk to people. Its primary focus is centered on character and story, that's why many people would probably consider it an adventure game. But this also doesn't give us the full picture of what Night in the Woods has to offer either. This particular scenario is a lot like a multiple choice question on a standardized test. While adventure game might be the most accurate answer to this question, it isn't a perfect one. Because although most of what you do in the game is talk to people, it's far from the only thing you'll do. Throughout the course of the game, you'll play bass with your band, climb on power lines, knife fight in the woods, grab a slice of pizza with your friends, shoplift from a knockoff Hot Topic, and many, many more things. And each of these situations has their own separate mechanics. So yes, broadly speaking, Night in the Woods should probably be considered an adventure game. But from time to time, it's also a rhythm game, a platformer, a dungeon crawler, a minigame collection, and even on rare occasions, a horror game. If you're trying to recommend Night in the Woods to a friend, calling it an adventure game is a pretty good choice, because it will most accurately give them an idea of what kind of experience they're in store for. But hopefully we can also start to see how this game in particular blurs those lines between genres more than most. And those blurry lines allow Night in the Woods to do some pretty unique things. In broader art criticism, there's a term for works of art that combine a number of disparate styles and influences and mesh them together to create a new cohesive whole, and we call this type of work a pastiche. Now, pastiche can be used to describe anything from music to film to a painting, even video games for that matter. And to me, one of the most interesting things about a pastiche is how it can manifest differently in different forms of media. In film, it's often used referentially as an homage or subversion of typical genre stereotypes. In music, we would generally call a pastiche a mashup, the salty and sweet combination of two sounds that seem like they shouldn't work together, but do. As it pertains to games, although the term is rarely used in game criticism, there have certainly been plenty of games over the years that could be described as a pastiche. In fact, because of the highly iterative nature of game development, you could potentially make the argument that every game ever made is a pastiche. But what I think is important about the way games blend genres, and what makes them fairly unique in this, is how bringing in these new outside elements to your work essentially changes what the game can say, what it can be about. After all, as we already established, defining a game's genre is largely about what you do in the game, and for many examples, especially with a lot of earlier games, what you do and what they are about are intrinsically tied together. Most games from the 8 and 16-bit era were about pretty simple things: adventure, saving a princess, saving the world, being a hero, and defeating evil. And these games usually had a few core mechanics to help you accomplish those goals. Whether it was jumping, swinging a sword, or shooting a blaster, all these games had a purpose and an action, what the game was about, and what you did in that game. And a lot of times, I think this connection is often thought of as mechanics first, especially if you're coming from the whole gameplay is king philosophy. But really, you can come at this from either angle. All that really matters is that your purpose and your action reinforce one another. And this formula is still used today. But the symbiotic relationship starts to get a little trickier to use when your game is no longer about simple things, which begs the question, what exactly do you do in a game that is no longer about adventure and instead is about people? People don't spend their day just doing one thing. people don't just run and jump, swing a sword, or shoot a gun. People can do all those things at any given time when the need arises. And so, this is why a game like Night in the Woods implements so many different styles of gameplay, to better simulate the multitude of different actions any given person will go through in their daily life. But the fascinating thing is, Night in the Woods is far from the only game to try this. The PS2 era, for example, is filled with games that started to throw in other styles of gameplay to give the player a more robust experience. As games grew more complex, they wanted to offer more than just a few core competencies. So this is why you could have a platformer that all of a sudden introduced a racing section, a rhythm-based minigame, or some arena combat segments. The downside of this approach, though, is that while these games often still had their one core mechanic it relied on, and that in most cases was well made and fun to play with, these add-on mechanics usually didn't have the same level of polish and typically felt more like roadblocks to progress instead of a meaningful expansion. It takes a lot of work and experience to make a good platformer, a good racing game, or a good rhythm game. And so, if your team is built to produce a high-quality version of one of those things, you're probably not suited to also make a good version of one of the others. So to avoid this problem, in the next couple of generations, developers stopped borrowing mechanics from other genres and instead started borrowing systems. This is why just about every game these days could be described as having quote-unquote RPG elements. Destiny is a shooter with RPG elements. God of War is an action game with RPG elements. Assassin's Creed is an open world game with RPG elements. Each of these games still has a core mechanic, a thing that you will spend most of the time doing in-game, only now that central experience is rounded out by implementing different systems from other successful games. But Night in the Woods is different. In a sense, it almost feels like a game from an alternate timeline, because it tackles that original problem from the PS2 era from an entirely different direction. Instead of scrapping the idea of bolting on many different styles of gameplay due to how difficult it is to make each section its own full-fledged experience, Night in the Woods takes each of these segments and simplifies them down to their most basic form. You can do just about anything from open a window to poke a severed arm with a stick, just by moving one analog stick and pressing one button on the controller. All these separate parts don't have to be elaborate, they just have to be accurately representational. And on the rare occasion the game's mechanics require more complicated inputs, it simply accommodates for this by taking out any fail states. Messing up your bassline during band practice doesn't mean you failed and have to start over, it just means you played that song poorly. The story goes on, and the characters will even remark differently if you play a song well or not. Off the top of my head, I can only think of one instance where the game will make you play a scenario over again if you fail, the box moving minigame with Greg. And even still, if you mess up enough times, the game will eventually just move you along without making you perform the section perfectly. So from here, the obvious question is, why have these sections at all? If they have to be simplified to such a degree that most anyone could get through them without much challenge, what's the point? What do they add to the experience if you're just going through the motions? Well, first off, I would argue that a lot of our day-to-day lives do consist of just going through the motions, but that comparison aside, the biggest thing they add is a sense of connection and a sense of place. I'm not going to sit here and try and argue that the writing isn't the best part of Night in the Woods, and while I think all the things you do in between the dialogue are important, they're not exactly what keeps me coming back for more. Sure, this game could be pretty easily converted into a visual novel or even just a pure text-based adventure game, but I gained so much more out of my experience because these characters aren't just static drawings on the screen. I wouldn't have the same connection to the characters if I couldn't actively be a part of breaking light tubes with Greg, or picking out groceries with Bea, or going stargazing with Angus. I wouldn't have the same attachment to Possum Springs if I didn't get to make the rounds every day, checking in with all the residents and seeing how things change slowly over time. And you know, I find it kind of funny how some of the most ardent critics of story-centric games like Night in the Woods often cling to the idea that real games are only those that truly embrace what makes the medium unique, that sufficiently worship at the altar of the almighty interactivity. And yet, there's hardly a single thing you do in Night in the Woods that the player doesn't have a hand in. Whether it's something as inconsequential as grabbing a can of soda or getting in some target practice with a crossbow, almost every action in the game involves the player in one way or another. Night in the Woods isn't just an adventure game to me, it's whatever kind of game it needs to be at the time. And I don't have any problem with visual novels or more traditional adventure games, most of which do have their own form of interactivity via narrative or dialogue choices. But a game like Night in the Woods goes so much further by borrowing pieces from so many other genres. Although their relative simplicity might make you think they're insignificant additions to the overall package, their impact on how you feel about the characters and their world is, in my mind, monumental. They're the difference between making a game that simply has good writing and making a game that is actually about something. In this case, a game about people. Well, again, animal people, but you get it.